My name is Renee Calloway. I am 44 years old, and 3 years ago I lost a pregnancy. I had told exactly 2 people about. One of them was my mother. The other was my aunt, Deborah, who found out only because she happened to be in the hospital waiting room the night it happened, and who promised me, standing by the vending machines at 2 in the morning, that it would never leave that hallway. Last spring, at my brother's retirement dinner. In front of 41 relatives, 2 of my coworkers, and my mother's pastor, Deborah picked up the microphone meant for toasting my brother, looked directly at me, and said that some people in this family don't understand real loss, and then she told them all of it. The month. The hospital. The word she wasn't supposed to remember. She did it because I had given her son 30 days to move out of a house that was never hers to occupy, a house my grandmother had left to me alone, in writing, for reasons Deborah had spent 2 years pretending not to understand. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I set down my water glass, thanked my brother for 30 years of good work, and sat back down. But I had a folder in my car that night that Deborah did not know existed, and an envelope in my kitchen drawer that I had been too afraid to open for 2 years. Neither of those things stayed closed for much longer. If you have ever been the person in your family who holds everything together while getting credit for none of it, stay with me, because this story is for you. And if you are new here, consider subscribing, because what happened over the following 6 weeks is the kind of quiet reckoning I think a lot of families need and very few ever get. I should explain who I was before that night, because the woman who set down her water glass so calmly did not become that way by accident. I had 38 years of practice. I am a hospice social worker in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I have spent 19 years sitting in the kind of rooms most people spend their whole lives avoiding, helping families say goodbye to people they loved, and sometimes helping them say goodbye to people they did not know how to love correctly until it was almost too late. It is a strange qualification for the story I am about to tell you, but it turned out to matter more than my nursing degree or my mediation training ever did. I know what it looks like when a family is performing grief for an audience, instead of feeling it honestly. I have seen it from the outside my entire career. I did not expect to see it from the inside, wearing my own name tag. I was the third of 4 children, and the only daughter, in a family that ran on unspoken assignments nobody voted on. My older brother Paul got to be the responsible one, which mostly meant showing up on time and being praised for it. My younger brothers, twins named Dale and Gary, got to be the funny ones, which meant they could say almost anything at a holiday table and be forgiven with a laugh. I got to be capable. Capable meant I drove our mother to chemotherapy appointments for 4 months in 2019 while also working full shifts. Capable meant I was the one who organized my grandmother's 90th birthday, who remembered every allergy and every grudge seating arrangement, who quietly paid the deposit when nobody else stepped up. Capable is a compliment that never once came with anyone asking if I was tired. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, was the one person in my family who noticed. She had a lake house on Higgins Lake, a modest 3-bedroom place with a screened porch and a dock that needed new boards every other summer, and she and I spent parts of nearly every summer there together starting when I was 9 years old. When she got sick in her final 2 years, I was the one who drove up on weekends, who sat with her hospice nurse and translated the medical language for the rest of the family, who held her hand the night she stopped being able to speak in full sentences. My mother came when she could. Deborah, my mother's older sister, came twice in 18 months, both times for under an hour, both times with a story about how busy her son Tyler's business ventures were keeping her. Tyler is Deborah's only child, 34 years old at the time of the dinner, and for as long as I can remember he has been the family's designated exception. He dropped out of 2 different colleges. He started 3 businesses that each survived under a year, a food truck, a phone repair kiosk, and something involving cryptocurrency that none of us, including him, could ever fully explain. Every time one of these ventures collapsed, Deborah found a way to frame it as bad luck rather than a pattern, and every time, someone in the family quietly absorbed the cost. My mother had loaned him $4,000 in 2017 that was never repaid and never mentioned again. I had co-signed nothing, ever, because even then, something in me refused. I was married once, briefly, in my early 30s, to a man named Craig who I do not need to spend much time on here except to say that we tried for 2 years to have a child before the marriage ended for reasons that had nothing to do with that trying. 3 years ago, at 41, I was in a relationship with a man named Mark, a high school science teacher I had been seeing for a year and a half, and I got pregnant for what would be the only time in my life. I was 11 weeks along when I lost it, on a Tuesday night, in an emergency room 40 minutes from my apartment, with my mother in the waiting room because Mark was out of town for his father's surgery and I had panicked and called her. Deborah was there because she had been visiting my mother that weekend and had driven her to the hospital. I remember very little about that night except the fluorescent lights and the particular kindness of a nurse named Priya, but I remember Deborah, in the hallway afterward, taking my hand in both of hers and saying, "This stays with us. Nobody else needs to carry this." I believed her. I had no reason not to. Grief makes you trust people you might otherwise be more careful with. My grandmother died 14 months later, in the fall, in the lake house she loved, with hospice care I had arranged and mostly supervised myself. She left a will that had been updated 8 months before her death, a fact that would matter enormously later, and in that will, the lake house on Higgins Lake went to me. Not to my mother. Not divided among the grandchildren. To me, specifically, by name, with a clause that referenced, in careful legal language, the years of care and presence provided during my final illness. Deborah did not attend the reading of the will. She heard about the house from my mother 2 days later, over the phone, and according to my mother, there was a long silence before Deborah said, "Well, that's certainly one way to do it," and changed the subject. I did not think much of the comment at the time. I should have. For the first year after my grandmother's death, the lake house sat mostly empty. I went up when I could, kept the utilities running, paid the property taxes out of my own savings, and told myself I would eventually decide whether to sell it, rent it, or keep it as the retreat my grandmother had clearly intended it to be. Then, in the spring, Tyler's 3rd business failed, his lease in Lansing ended, and my mother called to ask, on Deborah's behalf, whether Tyler could stay at the lake house just for the summer, just to get back on his feet. I said yes. I want to be honest about that, because everything that came afterward makes more sense if you understand that I was not someone looking for a reason to say no. I liked the idea of the house being used instead of sitting empty. I told my mother I would need Tyler to cover utilities and a modest amount toward the property taxes, somewhere around $400 a month, which was well under market rent for a lake house of that size. My mother relayed this. Tyler agreed, according to her. I never got it in writing, which I now recognize as the first mistake in a story built almost entirely out of my own reasonable assumptions. Summer became fall. Fall became winter. Tyler did not leave, and the $400 arrived exactly twice in 11 months, both times partial. When I raised it with my mother, she would sigh and say some version of, "He's trying, Renee. You know how hard it's been for him." When I raised it with Deborah directly, in a phone call I still remember clearly, she said, "That house should have gone to the family anyway. I don't understand why you're being difficult about this now." That sentence, "the house should have gone to the family anyway," became something Deborah repeated in different forms over the following year, at holidays, in group texts, once in a birthday card to my mother that my mother read aloud without apparently noticing what it implied. The house had gone to a member of the family. Me. But in Deborah's version of events, I had somehow acquired it through an oversight that the rest of them were simply too polite to correct. By the following spring, I needed the house back, or at minimum, I needed the arrangement to become an actual lease with actual rent, because a hospice social worker's salary in Western Michigan does not comfortably absorb a second property's taxes, insurance, and winterizing costs indefinitely, especially not while also paying off the last of my student loans and, quietly, saving for a procedure I will explain shortly. I called Tyler directly this time, not through my mother, and told him I needed him to either sign a proper lease at $700 a month, which was still below market, or begin looking for another place, with 60 days to transition. He was polite on the phone. He said he understood. He did not do either. 60 days passed. Then 90. In June, I drove up to Higgins Lake myself, let myself in with my own key, and found the house in a state that made my chest tighten, cigarette burns on the porch railing. My grandmother had refinished herself, a broken window in the second bedroom covered with a garbage bag and packing tape, and a stack of unopened certified mail from the county addressed to me, which I would later learn was a code violation notice for an unpermitted space heater setup Tyler had rigged in the garage. I gave him 30 days, in writing this time, hand-delivered, with a copy sent to my mother so there could be no confusion about what had been communicated. This is the part where I need to tell you about the dinner, because the 30-day letter and the retirement dinner landed 12 days apart, and I do not believe that was a coincidence. Though I have never been able to prove Deborah knew the letter's exact date. My brother Paul was retiring after 26 years at a manufacturing plant outside Grand Rapids, and my mother had organized a dinner at a banquet room attached to a restaurant called the Mill Race, the kind of place with a small stage and a microphone stand left over from wedding season. 41 people came. I sat at a table with Mark, my two coworkers Denise and Angela, who Paul had specifically asked me to invite because they had helped him through a rough patch years earlier, and my mother's cousin Rosalind, who I mention only because she would later become an unexpectedly important witness. The toasts began normally. Dale went first, told a story about Paul teaching him to drive a stick shift, and everyone laughed in the right places. Gary followed with something about their father, who had passed years earlier, and the room went appropriately soft for a moment. Then my mother stood, said a few warm sentences about watching her oldest son grow into a steady man, and sat back down to applause. Deborah stood next. I assumed she intended a similar toast, something brief and warm about her nephew. Instead, she walked to the small stage, picked up the microphone that had been resting in its stand since the DJ from an earlier event that day had left it, and said that she wanted to say something about family, real family, and about people who forget what family is supposed to mean when it becomes inconvenient for them. I felt the temperature of the room change before I understood why. Denise, beside me, went still in the particular way people go still when they sense something is about to happen to someone they know. Deborah looked directly at me and said that some people in this family had decided that a house, her voice cracked slightly on the word, theatrically, I would later think, though at the time it read as real, that a house mattered more than a mother's grandson having a roof over his head. She said that some people had 30 days to throw a struggling young man into the street. I did not say anything yet. I thought foolishly that this was the worst of it, that she would sit down after making her point, humiliating as it was, and I would deal with it privately afterward. The way I dealt with almost everything in my family, privately, patiently, alone. Then Deborah said that she understood loss too, that everyone in this room had lost things. That some people in this family knew exactly what real loss felt like and still couldn't extend basic compassion to their own blood. And then she said it. She said the word. She named the month. She said, into a microphone, in front of my coworkers, in front of my mother's pastor, in front of Rosalind and 38 other people, that I had lost a baby 3 years ago and that apparently that kind of pain hadn't taught me anything about grace. I want to tell you what the room sounded like in that moment, but the truth is I remember very little sound at all. I remember Mark's hand finding mine under the table. I remember Angela's face, stricken, confused, clearly working out in real time whether she had heard correctly. I remember my mother, 3 seats down from me, with her hand pressed flat against her mouth, not moving, not standing, not doing the one thing I would have needed her to do, which was to take the microphone out of her sister's hand. I stood up. Not quickly. I want to be clear about that, because I have thought about this moment more times than I can count, and the detail that matters most to me is that I did not run, and I did not shout, and I did not give Deborah the version of me that would have let her tell this story afterward as proof that I was unstable or dramatic or unfit to be trusted with anything, including a house. I stood up, walked to my brother, who was staring at his own hands, and I said, quietly enough that only the front 2 tables could hear, "Congratulations, Paul. 26 years is a real accomplishment, and you deserved a better toast than the one you just got." Then I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, set it down, and sat back down in my chair. Deborah, thrown by the fact that I had not reacted the way she had clearly built her moment to expect, finished with something vague about family needing to remember what matters, handed the microphone back to the stand, and returned to her seat. The DJ, mercifully, started playing music almost immediately, and the room fractured into the kind of overlapping, uncomfortable conversation that happens after something has gone badly wrong and nobody knows the correct response. I stayed for 11 more minutes. I hugged Paul goodbye. I told him I was proud of him and meant it completely. Then Mark drove me home, and I did not cry until I was in my own driveway, in the passenger seat, with the engine off, and even then it was quiet, controlled crying, the kind I had gotten unfortunately skilled at over 19 years of sitting with dying strangers and their complicated families. What Deborah did not know, sitting in her car on the way home that night, likely satisfied that she had reminded everyone exactly who held power in this family, was that I had a folder in my own car containing a certified copy of my grandmother's will and a property deed with my name on it as sole owner, notarized 8 months before her death, filed with the county, and completely uncontestable. And in my kitchen drawer at home sat an envelope my grandmother's estate attorney had handed me the week after her funeral, sealed, with my name written on the front in my grandmother's own handwriting, which I had not been able to open in over 2 years because I was afraid of what grief it might reopen. I would open it in 9 days. But first, I needed to understand something that had been bothering me for weeks, something about timing that did not add up. The details that didn't make sense. The morning after the dinner, I did not call anyone. I went to work because a woman named Ilse Vandermeer was dying in a hospice bed on the west side of the city, and her daughter needed help understanding what the next 48 hours might look like, and that work does not pause for a person's own humiliation, nor should it. I got through the day the way I get through most difficult days, by being useful to someone whose problems were, in that moment, larger than mine. It was on the drive home that the timing question surfaced properly for the first time. Deborah had referenced the 30-day letter in her toast, though not by name. 30 days to throw a struggling young man into the street was close enough to the actual language of my letter that it could not have been coincidence. I had hand-delivered that letter to Tyler on a Thursday, and mailed a copy to my mother the same day, first class, no tracking. The dinner was the following Tuesday. My mother would have received her copy on Saturday at the earliest, given standard delivery times, which meant Deborah could only have learned the specific details, 30 days, the exact framing, from my mother, in the 3 days between Saturday and Tuesday. I called my mother that evening, not accusingly, just to ask, gently, how the toast had come together, whether she'd known what Deborah intended to say. My mother's answer surprised me. She said Deborah had called her Sunday night, upset, saying she'd heard from Tyler that I was kicking him out with no notice, and asking my mother directly what she knew about the situation. My mother, trying to be fair, had apparently read parts of my letter to her over the phone, including the 60-day history and the 30-day final notice, thinking it would help Deborah understand I had been more than patient. What my mother did not know, and what I did not learn until several days later, was that during that same call, Deborah had asked her, almost as an aside, whether Renee had ever really dealt with what happened a few years back, with the pregnancy, framing it as concern. As though she were worried about my emotional stability rather than gathering material. My mother, wanting to be helpful, wanting, as she always does, to smooth things rather than examine them, had answered honestly. She told Deborah I still didn't talk about it much, that she worried I hadn't fully processed it, that I threw myself into work instead. My mother had no idea she was handing her sister a weapon. She thought she was having a private conversation about a daughter she loved. This detail changed something for me. I had assumed, in the raw hours after the dinner, that Deborah's cruelty had been purely reactive, an ugly outburst provoked by anger over the house. Learning that she had spent 2 days gathering specific ammunition, asking pointed questions, waiting for the right stage with the right audience, told me this had not been reactive at all. It had been planned with the same energy most people reserve for planning a surprise party. The second detail that did not make sense arrived 4 days after the dinner, in the form of a text from Tyler, who I had not heard from since delivering the 30-day letter. It read, "Hey, Renee, sorry about how the dinner went. Mom shouldn't have said that stuff. Can we talk about the house though? I really can't move in 30 days. Is there any way to extend to like 6 months? Working on something big that's gonna pay off." Attached was a screenshot of what appeared to be an investment platform showing a modest cryptocurrency balance that I, admittedly no expert, recognized as the kind of thing that had already burned him once. I did not respond immediately. What struck me was the apology's shape, sorry about how the dinner went, as though the dinner had simply gone a certain way on its own, like weather. Rather than his mother having chosen, deliberately, to weaponize my grief in front of 41 people in service of his housing situation. He was not defending his mother, exactly, but he was also not condemning what she had done, and he was using the aftermath of it, whether he realized this or not, as leverage for a 6-month extension. The third detail, the one that finally made me understand the shape of what I was dealing with, came from Rosalind, my mother's cousin, who called me 9 days after the dinner, on a Thursday evening, her voice careful in the way of someone who has decided to do something slightly outside her usual role. Rosalind told me she had been seated close enough to hear something before the toasts began, while people were still finding their tables. She said she'd overheard Deborah, near the coat check, telling another relative, a second cousin named Patricia, "Wait until you hear what I'm about to say up there. It's going to put things in perspective for some people real fast." Rosalind said she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Assumed it was about the retirement, but afterward, replaying the evening, she couldn't stop thinking about the phrase "put things in perspective" and what it had actually meant. I thanked Rosalind. I did not ask her to repeat this to anyone else, and I want to be clear that at no point in this story did I ask a single person to testify or take sides on my behalf. I simply listened, the way I have spent 19 years learning to listen, and I wrote down what she told me in a notebook I keep for work, the same notebook where I track medication schedules and family dynamics for hospice cases, because some habits do not know the difference between a dying patient's family and your own. That Thursday night, after Rosalind's call, I sat at my kitchen table with Mark across from me. And I finally told him I was ready to open the envelope. He had known about it for over a year. Had gently asked about it twice and never pushed, understanding, I think, that grief on a schedule is not grief at all. But something about the accumulation of that week, the calculated timing, Tyler's leveraging apology, Rosalind's overheard sentence, made me feel, for the first time since my grandmother's funeral, that I could open it without it undoing me. I still did not open it that night. I put it back in the drawer and told Mark I needed one more day. I needed to understand what I actually believed before I let my grandmother's last words to me become part of a fight I hadn't chosen but could no longer avoid. I opened the envelope on a Friday evening, alone, sitting on my grandmother's own porch swing, which I had moved from Higgins Lake to my apartment's small balcony 3 years earlier without ever quite explaining to myself why. Mark had offered to be there and I had told him, honestly, that I needed to be by myself for this one thing, and he understood, because that is who Mark is, a man who has never once needed me to perform my grief for his comfort. The envelope contained 4 handwritten pages, my grandmother's careful, slanted cursive. The same handwriting from 30 years of birthday cards. I am not going to share every word of that letter, because some things a person keeps, but I will tell you the parts that mattered too. What happened next? She wrote that she had watched, over many years, the way our family assigned roles to people without ever asking whether those roles were fair, and that she had watched me carry the role of the capable one since I was a teenager, long past the point where it stopped being a compliment and started being an excuse for everyone else to do less. She wrote that she was leaving me the lake house not because I loved it more than anyone else, though she believed I did, but because I was the only person in the family who had never once asked her for anything in nearly 40 years, and she wanted, before she died, to be the one who finally gave me something without my having to earn it through exhaustion first. She also wrote something I did not expect, something about Deborah specifically. She said that she loved her daughter, my mother, and her daughter's sister, Deborah, both deeply. But that she had watched Deborah spend decades building a version of fairness that always seemed to require other people's sacrifice and never her own, and that she suspected, when Deborah learned about the house, there would be difficulty. She will tell herself a story where she is the wronged party, my grandmother wrote. She has always been able to do this. Do not let her convince you that her story is the true one just because she says it loudly and says It first. The final page was about my miscarriage. My grandmother had known, I had told her. Myself, in one of our last real conversations, 3 weeks before she lost the ability to speak. Clearly. She wrote that she was sorry she would not get to meet the family I might someday have, and that whatever grief I was still carrying about that loss was mine, entirely mine, to keep private or share exactly as I chose, and that no one, family included, had the right to take that choice away from me. If anyone in this family ever tries to use your pain as a tool, she wrote, in the final lines, I want you to remember that the house is yours because you never once used your own pain as a tool against anyone else. That is the difference between you and some of the rest of us, Renee. Don't let anyone talk you out of it. I sat on that porch swing for close to an hour after I finished reading. What I felt was not exactly relief and not exactly grief, but something adjacent to both, a settling. I understood, reading my grandmother's handwriting, that she had anticipated almost exactly what would happen years before it happened, with a clarity that made me wonder how many quiet years she had spent watching Deborah operate before deciding to put any of it in writing. The next morning, I did 3 things. First, I called the estate attorney who had handled my grandmother's will, a measured, unhurried man named Arthur Beaumont, and asked him to confirm, formally and in writing, that the deed transfer had been completed and recorded 8 months prior to my grandmother's death, which would eliminate any possible argument that the will had been altered under undue influence in her final, more vulnerable weeks. He confirmed this within the hour, and offered, unprompted, to draft a formal notice to Tyler, reiterating the 30-day timeline with the weight of legal letterhead behind it, in case I wanted it. I told him I would let him know. Second, I went through old voicemails on my phone, an archive I rarely touch, looking for something I remembered but had never had a reason to revisit, the message Deborah had left me the week after my miscarriage, the one where she had reiterated, in her own voice, on a recorded line, that what happened would stay between us. I found it. 28 seconds long, from a number saved as Aunt Deb, dated correctly, untouched, exactly as it had been left. In it, her voice softer than I had heard it in years, she said, Renee, honey, it's Deb. I just wanted to say again, what happened at the hospital, that's not anyone's business but yours. I won't say a word to a soul, I promise you that. You take care of yourself. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after listening to it twice. Third, I called Mark and asked him if he would come with me to a family meeting I intended to request, not a confrontation, not a dinner table ambush, but a specific, scheduled conversation at my mother's house, with my mother, Deborah, and Tyler present, where I would lay out exactly what was going to happen next. Mark said yes without hesitation, and then asked me a question that stayed with me for the rest of that week. He asked whether I wanted to win the argument or fix the relationship, because he had learned, in his years teaching teenagers, that a person rarely gets to do both, and I should decide in advance which one mattered more, so that whatever happened in that room, I would not lose sight of the answer partway through. I told him I wanted to protect what my grandmother had given me and stop financially subsidizing people who had shown me, repeatedly, that they viewed my patients as a resource to extract rather than a kindness to reciprocate. I did not know yet whether that meant the relationship could survive. I only knew that continuing to give without protection had already cost me more than I had left to give. I called my mother on Sunday and asked her to arrange a meeting at her house the following Saturday, telling her honestly that I needed to talk with her and Deborah and Tyler together about the house, and that I would appreciate her not turning it into a larger gathering. My Mother, to her credit, did not argue or deflect. She sounded tired in a way I recognized, the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent decades managing conflict between people. She loves and has finally run out of managing left to do. She said, quietly, I should have said something at the dinner. I've been sick about it all week. It was the closest thing to an apology I had received from anyone in my family since the retirement dinner, and I told her I appreciated her saying it, which I did, though I also understood that an apology delivered privately, a week later, to me alone, was a different thing than standing up in that banquet room and taking the microphone out of her sister's hand when it mattered. Before the Saturday meeting, I did something I had never done in my adult life, which was to write out, in advance, exactly what I intended to say, in the same structured way I prepare for difficult family conferences at work, where emotions run high and clarity is the only thing standing between a peaceful resolution and a preventable disaster. I wanted 3 outcomes from that meeting. I wanted Tyler out of the house on a defined, enforceable timeline. I wanted an acknowledgement, not necessarily a groveling apology but a real acknowledgement from Deborah that what she had done at the dinner was wrong. And I wanted to be honest. Finally, about the pattern of financial requests that had quietly drained me for years, in ways my family had never fully totaled up because no single request, on its own, ever looked unreasonable. I also decided, the night before, that I would offer one more fair path before taking any harder action, because my grandmother's letter had reminded me that the difference she saw between Deborah and me was that I had never used my pain as leverage, and I did not want that difference to disappear just because I was angry. So the offer I planned to bring into that room was this: Tyler could have 90 days, not 30, to move out, twice what I had originally offered, and I would personally help him find an affordable apartment and would not charge him for the 11 months of unpaid rent already owed, effectively forgiving nearly $6,000 if he and Deborah agreed, in front of my mother, to stop framing the house as something that had been unfairly kept from the family, and if Deborah acknowledged clearly what she had done at the dinner. Saturday arrived cold and overcast, early October, and I drove to my mother's house with Mark, who waited in the car at my request, close enough to be there if I needed him, far enough to let this be a conversation among blood relatives without an audience that might make anyone perform rather than speak honestly. My mother's kitchen table, where I had eaten probably 4,000 meals across my lifetime, felt smaller than I remembered as I sat down across from Deborah and Tyler, with my mother at the head, visibly uncomfortable. A cup of coffee in front of her that she never once touched. I laid out the offer clearly and without preamble. 90 days. Nearly $6,000 in forgiven back rent. Help finding a new place for Tyler. In exchange, I wanted the framing to stop, and I wanted Deborah to acknowledge what she had done. Tyler, to his credit, looked relieved and started to say something that sounded like acceptance, but Deborah cut him off before he finished the sentence. She said that she didn't understand why I needed an apology for telling the truth, that everyone in the family already knew about the miscarriage anyway, that she'd simply said it out loud, and that if I was so embarrassed by my own life that I couldn't handle people knowing about it, that wasn't really her problem to solve. She said the real issue was that I had always thought I was better than the rest of the family because I had a house and a career and no one depending on me, and that maybe it was time someone finally said that out loud too. I want to be honest with you about how that landed, because it was worse, in some ways, than the microphone had been, because there was no crowd to perform for this time, no audience to justify the performance. This was Deborah, unfiltered, telling me directly that she believed what she'd done was not only acceptable but deserved I did not raise my voice. I told her that everyone in the family did not, in fact, already know. That my coworkers had not known, that my brother's pastor had not known, that I had chosen deliberately who received that information and when, and that she had taken that choice away from me in a room full of people, using a promise she had made to me by name, in a hospital hallway, at 2 in the morning, 3 years earlier. I told her I had kept the voicemail where she made that promise, and that I was not interested in relitigating whether it had happened, only in what would happen next. Deborah's face changed slightly at the mention of the voicemail, a small tightening around her eyes that told me she had either forgotten it existed or had never imagined I would keep it. She recovered quickly, said something dismissive about how a voicemail from years ago proved nothing except that I liked to hold on to grudges, but the tightening had already told me what I needed to know. I told her the offer of 90 days and forgiven rent was now withdrawn, and that instead, the original 30-day letter stood, effective immediately, meaning Tyler now had 18 days remaining rather than the 90 I had offered 10 minutes earlier. I told her that if the house was not vacated by that date, I would proceed with a formal eviction process through the county, supported by the deed, the will, and Arthur Beaumont's letter confirming the transfer had occurred 8 months before my grandmother's death, well outside any window that could be challenged as undue influence. Tyler, panicked now, asked if we could still talk about an extension, separately, without his mother. I told him yes, that I was willing to speak with him directly, as an adult, about a reasonable path forward, but that any conversation happening in the room right now, with his mother present, was over. My mother, who had said almost nothing through the entire exchange, finally spoke. She looked at Deborah and said, in a voice I had rarely heard her use, "You need to apologize to your niece. Not because of the house. Because of what you said at that dinner. I have been ashamed of myself all week for not stopping you, and I am not going to sit here and let you pretend it didn't happen." It was the most direct thing I had heard my mother say to her sister in my entire life, and though it came a week later than I needed it, I understood, watching her say it, what it had cost her to finally say it at all. Deborah did not apologize that day. She said, stiffly, that she was sorry I felt hurt, which is not the same thing as an apology, and everyone at that table knew it, including her. I stood up, told Tyler I would text him about a time to talk directly, thanked my mother for having us, and left. The 18 days that followed were quieter than I expected, though not peaceful, not exactly. Tyler and I spoke twice, both times without Deborah, and both times he was more reasonable than he had been in over a year, perhaps because for the first time the consequence in front of him was concrete and unavoidable rather than something that could be delayed with an apology text and a screenshot of a cryptocurrency balance. I did not reinstate the full 90-day offer, but I extended the deadline by 2 weeks to give him time to secure a lease on a small apartment in Roscommon he had found, and I forgave half of the back rent rather than all of it, a decision that felt, to me, like the difference between generosity and self-erasure. He accepted. He moved out on a Thursday in late October, and I drove up that weekend to assess the damage, which was significant but not beyond repair. The porch railing would need replacing, the garage would need the unpermitted heater setup removed and inspected, and there was a water stain on the living room ceiling from a leak nobody had reported. I hired a contractor I trust, a man named Walt Feeney who had done work for my grandmother for 15 years, and began the slow process of restoring the house to something closer to what it had been. Arthur Beaumont's letter, formally establishing the timeline of the deed transfer, arrived at Deborah's house the same week Tyler moved out, sent not as a threat but as a matter of record because I had learned over the preceding month that ambiguity was the exact soil Deborah's version of events had grown in, and I did not intend to leave any ambiguity behind for future holidays to reinterpret. The confrontation I had expected, a second, louder version of the retirement dinner, staged at Thanksgiving or Christmas, never actually came, and I think that surprised me more than anything else that happened. Instead, what came was smaller and, in its own way, more telling. Deborah stopped attending family gatherings where I was confirmed to be present. She sent a card at Thanksgiving addressed only to my mother's household, my name absent, which my mother mentioned to me with visible pain in her voice. Rosalind told me, a few weeks later, that Deborah had begun telling a modified version of the story at a smaller gathering of her own friends, one where the house had been unfairly withheld from the family, and where I had made a scene about something at a family dinner that she described only vaguely. I heard about this secondhand and decided, deliberately, not to correct it or chase it down. My grandmother's letter had told me the difference between us and chasing down. Every distorted retelling of what had happened felt like exactly the kind of thing that would erase that difference. What did change, undeniably, was the family's internal weather. My mother began calling me more often, not to relay messages from Deborah, but simply to talk, the way I imagined she might have called me all along if so much of her energy had not been spent for decades keeping her sister and her daughter in some fragile equilibrium. Paul, my brother, called me the week after the confrontation at my mother's kitchen table, having heard a version of it from our mother, and said simply, I should have stood up at my own dinner. I was too stunned. I'm sorry I didn't. Dale and Gary, my younger brothers, sent a group text a few days later that said only, we heard you good, which, for two men who communicate primarily through jokes, was as close to a formal statement of support as I had ever received from either of them. The most unexpected development came in November, nearly 6 weeks after the retirement dinner, when Tyler called me, not about the house, which by then was settled, but to say that he had been thinking about the dinner and about the voicemail I had mentioned, and that he wanted to tell me something. He said that his mother had called him the night before the dinner, upset about the 30-day letter, and had told him, almost in passing, that she had something she could say that would shift the whole conversation if things at dinner went badly for him. He said he had not understood, at the time, what she meant, and had not asked, because some part of him had not wanted to know. He said he was telling me this because he had felt sick about it for weeks and needed to say it out loud to someone, and I was the only person who deserved to hear it. I thanked him. I did not tell him it changed anything about my decisions regarding the house, because it did not, but I told him honestly that hearing it mattered to me, because it confirmed something I had already suspected but had chosen not to dwell on, that Deborah had walked into that banquet room already knowing, in some form, what she might say if the evening required it. It was not a spontaneous cruelty born of anger. It was a contingency she had prepared and, when the moment presented itself, deployed. I did not confront Deborah directly with what Tyler told me. I considered it, briefly, in the days after his call, imagining a final conversation where I laid out every piece of evidence, the voicemail, Rosalind's overheard sentence near the coat check, Tyler's confession, and forced some kind of full accounting. But I kept returning to Mark's question from weeks earlier about whether I wanted to win the argument or fix the relationship, and I understood, with more clarity than I expected, that there was no version of that final confrontation that would fix anything. Deborah had already shown me, at my mother's kitchen table, exactly how she would respond to being confronted with the truth of what she'd done. She would not soften. she would defend. The only thing left to protect was myself, and I had already done that. Through the letter Arthur Beaumont sent, through the deed that could not be contested. Through the 18 days that became a firm and honored deadline. By early December, the house on Higgins Lake was repaired, the porch railing replaced with cedar boards that matched the ones my grandmother had installed years before, and I spent a weekend there alone, the first time I had stayed overnight in the house since before Tyler moved in. I sat on the dock in a coat too thin for the December cold, watching the lake begin to skin over with the first ice of the season, and I thought about my grandmother, and about the letter, and about how strange it was that the thing she left me to give me something without my having to earn it had become, instead, the exact battleground where I finally learned how to stop earning things that should have been freely given all along. It has been 8 months now since the retirement dinner, and I want to tell you honestly what remained, because a story like this does not end with everyone healed and every relationship repaired, and I think pretending otherwise would dishonor what actually happened. My relationship with Deborah has not recovered, and I do not believe it will, not in any meaningful way. We attended the same Easter gathering this year, the first family event we had both been present for since the confrontation at my mother's table, and we spoke perhaps 4 sentences to each other the entire afternoon, all of them logistical. Could she pass the rolls, did I need a ride, that sort of thing. There was no warmth in it, but there was also no open hostility, which I have come to understand may be the most honest resting place too. People can reach after something like this. I do not hate her. I have sat with too many dying people and their complicated families to believe hatred does anything but calcify inside the person carrying it. But I no longer extend her the particular kind of trust that allowed her, 3 years ago, to hold my worst night in her hands and promise to protect it. That trust is simply gone, the way a bone heals crooked once it has been badly broken, functional but permanently changed. My relationship with Tyler is, unexpectedly, better than it has ever been. He is renting a small apartment in Roscommon, working steadily at a hardware store, and has not started a new business venture in 9 months, which for Tyler is close to a personal record. We talk occasionally, and last month he asked if he could come up to Higgins Lake for a weekend, not to stay, just to help me finish staining the new porch railing, and I said yes. We worked mostly in silence, which was fine with both of us, and at the end of the day he said, quietly, that he was sorry it had taken almost losing the relationship for him to understand how much I had actually given him over that year, not just the house, but years of quiet patience his own mother had never asked him to notice. My mother and I are closer now than we have been in over a decade, which is the part of this story that surprises me most, given how directly her earlier choices contributed to the pain of that dinner. But she has been consistent, in the months since, in a way that has slowly rebuilt something between us. She calls, she visits, she has stopped relaying Deborah's grievances to me as though they were neutral information I needed to process, and she told me, on a recent Sunday, that she has finally stopped trying to keep her sister and her daughter in balance, because she has realized that some scales were never meant to hold both of us at once, not fairly, and that pretending otherwise for 40 years had cost her more than she'd understood until she finally stopped. The lake house is mine, fully, undisputed, the deed and the will exactly as strong now as they were the night Deborah stood up with that microphone. Mark and I go up most weekends the weather allows, and last month, on the dock at sunset, he asked me to marry him, and I said yes, and I thought, in the quiet after, about how strange it is that this house, which became the center of the ugliest night of my adult life, is also the place where I said yes to the next chapter of it. The envelope, empty now, sits in a small frame on the wall of the lake house's screened porch, alongside a photograph of my grandmother from the summer I turned 12. I did not plan to display it. I found myself doing it almost without deciding, one afternoon in November. Needing some physical reminder in that specific room of the moment I finally believed her. Instead of believing the family's long-standing insistence that my patience was infinite and my pain was optional information other people got to distribute on my behalf. I think often about what my grandmother wrote, that the difference between Deborah and me was that I had never used my own pain as a weapon against anyone else. I do not think that makes me a better person than my aunt, exactly. I think it means I was raised by one specific woman in a family full of people assigning each other roles, to believe that grief belongs to the person who carries it, and that real love does not require an audience to prove itself. I lost a pregnancy 3 years ago that I still think about more often than most people in my life will ever know, and for one night, a woman I trusted turned that loss into a spectacle to win an argument about a house. I stayed calm that night, not because I had stopped feeling it, but because I finally understood that calm was the one thing in that room she could not take from me and use against me too. If you were in a room where someone used your worst moment against you, and you had the chance to either explode or stay perfectly, deliberately calm, which do you think would have actually protected you more, in the long run, and do you think the people watching would have understood the difference?